Mode.
Good morning and welcome to the TC Dojo. We had a couple of stragglers still coming in, but it looks like most everyone's here now. I know I'm excited. I hope you are too. Today we have Joe Devney, visiting Dojo Master and STC Fellow and Chair of the Berkeley chapter of the STC, here to talk about more than just unhappy customers as being and what the costs are when you skimp on documentation. It's an amazing presentation. I've been trying to get Joe for a long time, and now we have him. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning.
Let me switch to you, make you the presenter.
Yes, go ahead.
Show your screen.
Can you see it?
We can.
All right. Well, good morning. Thank you for joining. This is what the topic is and who I am. And as Liz just mentioned, the subtitle, which I did not put on the slide, is the potential business costs of skimping on documentation. And just so it's clear to everyone, this is the first of two presentations on this topic. Each of them will be self-contained, so you won't feel too lost if you can only attend one of the two. As for questions during this session, type them in as they occur to you, and I'll pause now and then to address them. Okay, what we'll be talking about is the potential business consequences of poor or missing product documentation. Missing is pretty self-explanatory, but what do we mean by, or what do I mean by poor documentation? This is what I mean. Incomplete. The documentation exists, but there's important information that is not included. Poorly designed, poorly organized, difficult to navigate, those are all kind of intertwined. It means someone did not think things through when they designed the documentation so that the information is well organized and it's easy for people to find what they need.
Hold on, Joe. Some people are saying they're having a hard time seeing the screen. Can we have just a check real quick, guys? If you're having trouble seeing the screen, if it didn't pop up behind, or whether you can see the slides, can you put in the check? Okay, everybody looks like it's got it now. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
That's okay. All right. Incorrect information. Oh, it's sad when this happens, but it means something is published and it's wrong. Not written for the right audience. It is too technical or not technical enough, depending on the situation. Persuasive rather than instructive. That is a marketing slant. I have seen this now and then where I have some documentation that tells me that this product will do all sorts of wonderful things without telling me exactly how to do that stuff. Happened to have a conversation online with the people who made my TV with that last night. They said change the aspect ratio with no instructions on how to find the right menu. Now that last bullet point, not simply some typographical errors. If you're worried about typos, there's not much more to do than to hire more copy editors or proofreaders. What I'm talking about today is the higher level skills of writing, organizing, and managing documentation. So how do companies end up with inadequate documentation? These are some causes you might be familiar with. Limited time to produce documents. The deadlines are short. Non-writers writing technical documentation. In my experience, it's often been engineers, sometimes managers, and in some very clueless companies, they have the administrative assistant or somebody write them. Too much influence from marketing, sort of leading to what I talked about before. The reason I mention that is that the marketing department does an important job. Their job is to keep the message of the from the company consistent and positive, but that's not always the best thing when you're writing technical documentation because the product, in some cases, is not perfect, and we have to acknowledge that. Unqualified technical writers, I have run into those every now and then. Certainly I see ads for them, probably because the company does not want to pay for an experienced person, so they have a long list of things the person has to do, and they want like 2 years experience, maybe a college degree, maybe you're not. So that can end up with not good documentation. Poorly designed templates, too strict attention to templates, that's usually because you're relying on templates that were not thought out well enough, didn't address all the possible things that could show up in the documentation. Now, again, the bottom bullet, management decisions. The thing that ties all this together is that these are areas that management has control over. What I hope you get out of this session is useful information you can take to your own management to convince them to give you or your department the resources to produce top-notch documentation. Let's look at the kinds of decisions that management can make. So, budget. Management definitely controls the budget. Will a particular document be produced? That is a decision made by someone above the level of the writer. Are you dedicated writers? That's an important question. Who does the writing? Having people other than writers is an especially bad idea, in my opinion. You know, like I said, engineers might write it. You probably know the problem. The engineers were hired because they were good at writing code, not because they were good at writing English. So what you end up with is a situation in which the documentation takes longer to produce and is of lower quality than something a professional writer would produce, or a professional illustrator for that matter. And it costs more not just because it takes more hours, but because an engineer makes more per hour than a writer. Okay. Tools and media. A lot of times management will just use Microsoft Word for documentation because it's familiar and everybody in the company already has it. But as you probably know, using Word for long or complex documents brings its own costs. I've spent way too many hours fixing formatting problems in Word, which I don't think is a productive use of my time at all. And we'll talk a little bit about external guidelines and user testing shortly. And the final note, why should managers not make writing or design decisions? Because they, most of the time anyway, have no background in technical writing or in document design. They may not know the details of what makes documentation more or less effective, something I assume everyone attending this session knows. They know what they like, which is not necessarily the same thing as what's good. But whether they make good decisions or bad ones, they have the authority to get those decisions implemented. Let me give you a quick example from my own experience. On this slide, don't worry about what the text says. It's just a random paragraph I took out of context. What I want you to do is look at the design of the two paragraphs. The first one is a problem. The second one is a solution. This example is from a tech writing contract I worked a few years ago. When I started working with the documentation, I saw that it was fully justified, like the top paragraph. This interferes with readability. I'm sure you know about that part. But it's also easy to fix. I just redefined a couple of paragraph styles and went on with my work. But when the manager saw it, she told me to change it back. I explained why the justified text lowered the quality of the document, and it didn't help. All the documentation had to be justified because the director of IT liked the look. Now, as it happened, while I was on that project, 4 other tech writers cycled through the same department. Every one of them on their first day made the same change for the same reason, and every one of them was told to change it back for the same reason. So 5 experts in technical documentation who were trying to improve the documentation were overruled by a single manager who had his own opinion without the domain knowledge to back it up. Any questions?
No questions about the content right now.
Okay, then I will go on. Let's start looking at the scope of the problem of inadequate documentation. What we're looking at here is numbers for, quote, document-driven processes rather than necessarily just documentation, but it's still instructive. These are some of the potential consequences we're going to talk about. So this is a percentage of organizations who can have these problems. More than a third had compliance or regulatory requirements. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. A quarter lost a major customer. I know you understand the implications of that. Some of them were sued. That can be a very expensive consequence. And 17% paid a financial settlement of $50,000 or more, which I guess is probably cases where they did that in order to avoid being sued. These are the consequences I will be talking about. Now, a reminder, these are potential consequences. You might be lucky and bad documentation will never come back to bite you. But that's a risk that management should consciously decide to take once they know about the possibilities. Give you a second to read that. You may have heard people claim that, quote, nobody reads the documentation anyway. The survey that Sharon Burton conducted shows otherwise. Lots of people look at the documentation even before they decide whether to purchase a consumer product. Now this 7%. I think this is an interesting statistic. 7% doesn't seem like a large number. But consider it from the point of view of a sales manager who has to meet sales goals. How do you think he would react if you told him that something the company was doing, and that could be fixed if management wanted to do so, was shrinking his sales rep's potential market by 7%? Okay. If you can't figure out how to work the product, yes, you're going to be upset and angry. But how often does it happen? Let me just take a second to share an anecdote because I came close to this situation. I bought a DVD player and I couldn't get it to work. I called the support number. The customer service rep walked me through the checklist but didn't fix the problem. He said it must be a defective unit and told me to exchange it. So yeah, I went down to the store and exchanged it. But the replacement had the same problem. I called the tech support number again and talked to a different rep. He walked me through a similar checklist. Then he told me to press a button over on the side of the machine. That fixed the problem. So if I hadn't happened to get somebody on the second call who had the right information, I'd be in exactly the situation described on the slide. The installation manual written for the customer was inadequate. The troubleshooting information available to the customer service reps was inadequate. They nearly did lose a customer because of that, and they did get the extra expense of having to deal with the returned machine. I'll give you a second to read this internal efficiency slide. So losing revenue is one business cost. Another is lowered productivity. Do any of these things sound familiar to you? People waste time trying to find information or to find accurate information. This is time they could be spending doing something productive, like making sales calls or writing code. This is a problem that could be fixed by putting effort into organizing the information and making it easily accessible. Can it really help? Here's some useful information, a couple of very brief case studies. I'll let you read that. That's a very big increase in productivity. Here's another one from the pharmaceutical field. If you've worked in the pharmaceutical industry, you might know that this time saving would be a big deal. Reduce turnover. Fewer unhappy employees means fewer people leaving, fewer people to have to hire. Saves money. And we talked about compliance. Give you a second to read that. The heart of this example is really the efficiency thing again. In this case, Improving the way the documentation was organized reduced an external expense rather than an internal one. I'll talk about compliance in more depth in a minute. Okay. Any questions? I heard some typing.
No, just we're good.
We're good? Okay. Then I will charge on. So now regulations and lawsuits come into the picture, and the stakes get higher. You know about copyright? Copying is easy. Copying is not necessarily legal. Managers and other staff members might not think about this. Do you have a working knowledge of copyright principles? If you're a writer and you don't, I want you to look up copyright law on the web today. Let me share a couple of anecdotes from my own experience. Early in my career in tech writing, I worked at a contract at a large company in San Francisco. One day, the manager who had brought me in came to me with an unusual assignment, somewhat different than what I had been working on. Her boss had gone to a class put on by an outside training company. He brought back a 3-ring binder with materials from the class. What she wanted me to do was retype the material from the folder, from the binder, into the company template. In other words, take the training company's content and pretend it came from her company. I said no, and I explained why. This is exactly what copyright law was created to prevent. I get paid to know this stuff. Is it a big deal? It can be. My first instinct, if I were the victim of such infringement, would be to sue for the price of the class times the number of employees in the infringing company, tens of thousands of people. My lawyer might not agree, but it seems to me like it would be a good starting point. So the manager, the 2 managers in this case, did not see this as a problem at all, taking somebody else's content, pouring it into their template. At another company where I was an employee, I was asked to edit something written out by one of the software engineers. As I read the introductory material, the style seemed wrong. It sounded like marketing copy. I did a Google search on a few distinctive sounding phrases. It turned out that he had copied the first several paragraphs directly from the website of an industry group. Can't do that. I talked to my manager, who talked to his manager, and the copy text was removed. So a few things to remember about copyright. If you are a writer or an editor or someone in a related technical communication position, you need to understand copyright law. Your engineers might not know about it. Your managers might not think about it. You may be the local expert. You could help keep the company out of trouble. And you will not be alone in the fight if management disagrees with you. The corporate legal department will be on your side. Moving on from copyright to regulation, some industries have to follow regulations from government agencies. Some of the regulations may include requirements for documentation. And these are examples that I mean about regulatory agencies. So these are government agencies, airlines for the FAA, pharmaceuticals, the FDA, the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, is federal in the U.S. For electrical power and other things, SEC in the financial world, and so forth. There are a lot of them. And some companies are members of industry groups and need to conform to standards or regulations from them. Again, this can sometimes involve documentation. Now, you would assume that with formal penalties for not following the rules, companies would make a great effort to make their documentation conform. Unfortunately, they don't always do so. Let me take a moment to talk about one case where skimping on documentation had a very large cost. JetSco is the name of a Canadian airline company. Transport Canada is the equivalent of our Federal Aviation Administration. When the airline had a mishap, Transport Canada investigated. The audit that Transport Canada conducted found problems with the documentation. They found other problems as well. The documentation was part of the mix. And the penalty for this was not a direct fine, but it had a similar effect. The planes were ordered to fly at lower altitudes, greatly increased fuel costs. So operating the airplanes suddenly became much more expensive. The end came quickly. 50 days from the original incident until they effectively went out of business. They declared formal bankruptcy in May, and they were bought by somebody else the following year. Now, JetSco was a low-cost airline. It looks like one way they kept their own costs down was by skimping on the technical documentation. The lesson here is that if you are in a regulated industry, that can be a very bad idea. Any questions?
So far, so good.
All right. Well, people are paying attention. Okay. Spreading the word. The message I've been trying to get across today is actually aimed at management. You're the conduit. I hope there are some managers participating today. For the rest of you, I want to encourage you to tailor the message to your own workplace. The goal is to encourage companies to give technical publications enough resources to do a good job as a way to reduce costs or increase revenue, and to stay out of trouble. I've explained some ways in which skimping in this area can be an unwise business decision. You can give that broad message to your own management, but it will be more effective if you can do some research and identify specific problems and solutions at your own company. And always talk in terms of cost. That will include the cost of wasted employee time, or the cost of lost revenues, or the cost of potential fines and lawsuits. Management's job is to be concerned about increasing revenue and decreasing expenses. How do you send the message? In whatever way will be most effective in your workplace. Let me give you two examples from my own experience. When I was hired at my last corporate employer, they were using Microsoft Word to produce documentation. I kept track of the time I spent just fixing formatting errors caused by Word itself. Totally unproductive time, something I shouldn't need to do. I emailed my manager and explained how the Tech Pubs department could save lots of man hours by switching to FrameMaker. That email message was enough to start the discussion, and we did switch over to Frame. Took a very different approach with somebody else. You remember my client who really liked the fully justified text? That wasn't the only design decision that came from the IT director. I eventually set up a meeting with a manager and brought along the other tech writer. And I brought props, a stack of books about document design, including Edward Tufte's, if you know him. I explained that the document design decisions that people like me make are backed up by research or by conventional wisdom in our field. I explained readability. I wrote Edward Tufte's term data-to-ink ratio on her whiteboard. I made it clear that in a professional context, document design is not the result of a manager's whim. I didn't get all the changes I wanted, but I got some. So pick whatever approach is best considering your workplace and your own communication skills. And to go over the bullet points, that's the one I just mentioned, the first one. Then back up your argument with numbers whenever possible. And it's best if the numbers are specific to your company or industry. Now this is sometimes hard to get, but keep trying. As I said at the beginning, this is part one. Part two is tentatively scheduled for January 12th. Liz, can you give us an update on that?
Why? Making sure I'm not muted. Yes, we are on for January 12th. And what can you tell us what's in part two?
That's for part 2, yes.
Okay.
All right. In that presentation, I'm going to talk about a few actual cases like the Jetsco demise, but I'm going to go into much more detail. We'll look at the actual documentation that was problematic, and we'll get to discuss the problems in the documentation, which we're used to doing, and then try to think a little broader how we address that, what kind of messages do we give to management to keep them out of trouble. And these are the kinds of things we'll talk about: copyright infringement, regulatory agencies, lawsuits. That's an important lesson to keep in mind. In a product liability lawsuit, the product's documentation can be seen as the faulty part. Okay, that was the last I had.
All right.
Questions now? Or Liz, do you want to talk?
Okay, folks, if you want to type in your questions, I'm going to show you what's coming up while you have a chance to do that. So let me change slides back. Let me show you what's coming up. All right. Before we had Joe doing 2 parts, our next dojo is December, and we're going to talk about ageism in the TechCom workspace. Andrew Davis, he works for Technology Recruiters and has firsthand experience with this and can give you ideas about solutions, symptoms, and causes. It's going to be a really lively meeting, very interactive. Make sure that you come in December. Also, to talk about something else that we do is the TC Master Series Mastermind Group. It's a peer-to-peer mentoring group where you get to expand your network and offer solutions and think about things in ways that you never have before, because it's easier. It's not only more effective to learn with others, but more fun as well. All right. And coming up in January is TC Camp for anybody in the Bay Area. It's the only unconference for TechCom professionals. It's one day, it's a Saturday, and it's a really good time. If you don't know what an unconference is, make sure you go to tccamp.org to find out. Now let's see how we've got on the questions. First question is, will today's slides be made available to attendees? Joe, do you post on SlideShare?
I do not, and I don't generally post the slides because they're just part of the presentation itself.
Okay. It will be you'll be able to watch the slides again in the video, Nick. So
yeah, that'll be fine.
You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll be able to see all the slides. Next question. Can you please parse the difference between poor document organization and poor document design?
Sure. Document design is everything that goes on in the documentation except the words themselves. So when you're deciding what things to put, how to let the reader know what's more important and what's less important, how to put, how to make things readable, all sorts of things. I gave a whole class on this, so I can't do everything in a minute. Organization is specifically the content you have, what's the best way to organize it. With the documentation, the document design, you know how to illustrate what's important. With organization, you decide what's important and what you want to highlight. I've seen some bad ideas. For example, I worked in one company where they had a nicely designed document. It looked very nice, but they had these pages and pages of tables that should have been stuck in an appendix at the end. But they thought, no, it belongs in chapter 4. So anytime you just kind of browsed through the document, all you saw was these tables. Even if you were looking at something else, the other important information was kind of stuck at the very beginning or the very end. So that was good document design, but poor document organization. Does that help?
Well, we will see. Adam, if you can type in yes or no, that'd be great. This was a pretty good foundation for part 2. I'm really glad to have it. We've got one more question. Mm-hmm. Do you know of any current research on design standards for paper versus online?
I don't know off the top of my head, but a good place to start is a book that's actually a few years old, but it's a good starting place, and that's Dynamics in Document Design by Karen Schreiber, which I think is Schriber.
All right, I'll put that in the chat window. And her first name was what again?
Erin.
Erin. Okay, so that's in the chat window for everybody. Great. All right. So I'm looking forward to the next part because I know for me that real concrete examples sort of bring it home. Any preview or no?
A preview, oh yeah, I'm going to talk about very high stakes where people get sick, people die, companies go out of business, stuff like that. How much does it cost to be sued even if you win?
That's one to think about for sure. All right. Do you have any more questions coming in? I think that's it. Good. Well, I hope everybody joins us back in December and then again in January for the part 2 concrete examples of all these things Joe's been talking about. And we've got a great big thank you from several of the people for you, Joe, and from us.
Oh,
thanks.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad to do it.
All right, I'm correcting my spelling on Erin Schreiber's name because someone corrected me from the group.
Okay.
There we go. Excellent. Great session. Thanks, Joe, and we will see you again in January.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.